Hello and welcome. I have two very exciting guests, and we're going to talk about the future of the City of Vaughan, as well a little bit about the City of Toronto. I have Ken Greenberg, who's going to be a well-known author. He's an author of a book called Walking Home, Life and Lessons of a City Builder. And actually, I want to congratulate him because he won an award a year ago in 2010. It's the Thomas Jefferson Award for Excellence in Architecture, I believe. And it's considered the highest accolades, is what I read, for an architecture to receive. So congratulations, Ken.
Thank you.
And sitting with Ken is Deb Schulte, who is the regional councillor for the City of Vaughan. And I was just explaining to Ken that Deb Schulte is known as our quote-unquote environmentalist on council. And she's an aeronautical engineer, and I really respect her opinion. She really kind of can read all those engineering reports from the city and actually understand some of what's a little bit of gobbledygook to the rest of us. I'm so glad that I could get you two together because it was a really interesting read, and what I think Ken might be a little bit surprised to hear is that I actually chuckled a couple of times reading your book, and I can remember exactly a couple of times when. One was when you were talking about growing up in Brooklyn and how later on in life you appreciated the fact that you got to know your relatives so well, because I had my grandparents living across the street from me in Montreal. And the other time was Regent Park, that there was no park at Regent Park. Right. And I wondered about that. When I moved to Toronto and I would hear Regent Park, and I remember driving in the area a couple times wondering where the park is. So that was, you know, it's a light read, but so much information, and people don't have to be passionate about this topic to read and to glean a lot of information. What made you want to write it?
I got to a point in my life where I'd been working on these things for many, many years, and I finally decided it was now or never. And I made one cold call to the senior person at Random House, expecting that would be the first of a series, and I had a one-page outline at the time, and that was the only call I ever made. And the second decision was who to write the book for. There are lots of wonderful books on urban design, city planning, and so on for my peers. And I concluded that what would be much more interesting was to write this in a way that somebody who had no particular background in the subject and who would never buy a book on city planning might find interesting.
Well, you were 100% successful, because I have very little knowledge, and I found it really, I would almost use the word riveting, that it was one of those books you just can't put it down, because it flowed very well, and I kind of thought that you were going to have very, separate topics, and I would almost say that to follow up on that, to have more, you wrote a little bit about Jane Jacobs, who's so well known internationally even for her work, is to focus on some of the other people. You didn't really discuss anybody other than Jane. Were there other people that you came across that were really passionate about the City of Toronto and deserve some recognition for work they've done?
Jane probably got the most airtime in the book, because she and I became friends, believe it or not, within months of us both arriving in Toronto in 1968. I was a student, and I sort of plucked up my courage, having read Death and Life, and asked her if I could talk to her about my student project, not really expecting she would say yes, and she was generous enough to do that. And so we struck up a lifelong friendship for all the years that she was alive, and we were both here. So I had to give her a place of privilege. But I would also, in terms of Toronto, David Crombie, who was the one who recruited me to work at the City of Toronto, the tiny perfect mayor, as he's sometimes called, is a very, very special individual. And in fact, I talk about mayors because I've worked with great mayors around the world. And when they get cities, and they have a real sense of them, and we have, if you look south of the border, we have two wonderful mayors. Bloomberg, of course, and early indications are that Rahm Emanuel in Chicago is going to be one of those great mayors.
With vision and able to work with people, because it's all very nice to have somebody who's capable and able, and a lot of times people who get elected, they get elected because they're good at getting votes, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to do the job that they were elected to do in a way that's part of a team. In terms of cities, cities declined, and that sort of comes through in your book, because they lost their social gravity, I think is the term used. So I feel that Vaughan, this is what Deb and I are passionate about, that we're not in decline. It's still a city being built, but we're building it in little puzzle pieces that don't quite, there's no vision for the entire city. There's little pockets where people can walk to things and do things, but it doesn't flow through the whole city. And we want to have that social cohesiveness.
I just wondered if I could interject, because we did spend 3 years trying to get that cohesiveness through our, Vaughan Tomorrow process, where we're envisioning how the city could be a city rather than these disparate pieces that are trying to come together. And there was a lot of consultation in that process, which is what you talked about in the book, is coming to that consensus, making sure that everybody's involved, you understand why they have the position that they have, so that you can address that appropriately in the vision and the outcome. So I think we tried to do that. Now it's the matter of implementing. So we have an idea and a vision, and I think generally there's a lot of concern because we are transitioning from a suburbia to an urban area, and a lot of people are resistant to that intensity. But it's how you do it. You mentioned that in the book. It's how you do it. It's not. Go ahead. You speak to it because you.
Well, I would just offer two things, because I think you're really onto something in terms of what your community has to do. One of them is, and this is as much addressed to the professionals I work with as to ordinary folks, we have to get away from the abstracted formal language in which we talk about planning, which is only about official plans and zoning bylaws, and it's very focused on numbers, floor space index and heights.
Prescriptive.
Very prescriptive.
And how many parking spots for visitors and residents.
And find a way of talking about these things in everyday language, which is about our experience as human beings of the places that we inhabit, which is much more synthetic. It deals with all the qualities of place. And if you take the conversation out of the ball court of lawyers and planning technicians and bring it into a real civil society discussion about the future and about our children and our grandchildren and what kind of world we're living in and our daily life routines and what's available to us. And, as the title of my book suggests, very importantly, how much can you walk to? Because that's actually a great indicator of quality of life. The other thing, in Deb, in terms of your interest, is I have always found that the one thing that is the strongest way of bringing people across divides together is to talk about the environment. And when I'm describing the environment in this sense, I mean the natural environment. So I talk at great length about the city of St. Paul, where I had a terrific experience, and it was all about the Mississippi River, which had been neglected. The city had turned its back to the river, and the whole city of St. Paul realized that the watershed, every drop of water that fell in St. Paul eventually found its way into the Mississippi River. So it wasn't just this narrow band of river running through the two banks of downtown and the city. It was actually the hydrology, which sounds very technical, but all the creeks and ravines and trails is actually what everybody in St. Paul shared.
Well, what's interesting with St. Paul is it made me think about Vaughan. I know I'm obsessed with Vaughan. I apologize.
No, I think that's a great thing.
It made me think of Vaughan because there was a plan to build what I considered, you didn't really call it that, a self-contained community across from the downtown, across from the Mississippi River. And this community, the developer thought he was going to be able to get it by because it contained a lot of, your sort of lingo. There was office space, retail space, living space, and it would be really a self-contained little world all on its own. But what you, I think, were able to point out is what did that bring to the rest of the community?
Right.
So they were going to have their little self-contained community and basically have very little interaction and maybe draw people and businesses away, sort of what was concerned about Canary Island, that they were worried that all these businesses would relocate, but then the recession a recession hit, and it destroyed it. And the same thing you pointed out with St. Paul is, you know, if they would build on that scale and then the recession would have hit, which it did, that we always have to consider that when we're doing projects. Well, Vaughan is very focused on a very self-contained small community at the junction of Jane Street and Highway 7.
Vaughan
Right?
Corporate Center.
The Vaughan Corporate
Yes.
Center.
Yep.
And, you know, and everybody talks about, you know, we'll be able to walk, we'll be able to walk, we'll be able to walk. Well,
What about the rest of it?
what about the rest of our community? And I'm concerned, actually, is it going to draw businesses away from locating in other? I would prefer to see, instead of one huge corporate center, I would have preferred to see the city make an effort to take small areas, and instead of the way we have now, we have these huge industrial pockets, you know, which is where our little studio is, where nobody's living near here, so nobody could walk to work in all of this area. And then there's pockets of restaurants, and then there's pockets where people live.
Right.
And to me, the whole point was to have, you know, a little bit of living and a little bit of working and mixing it around, and somehow encouraging people, maybe with tax credits, to live close to where they work.
You know, I'm going to relate your discussion from Vaughan back to Toronto, because lo and behold, here we are in 2011, and the mayor is proposing a giant mega mall or lifestyle center on the waterfront, which would have exactly the same effect on all the retailers in South Riverdale, nearby neighborhoods, in Corktown, all the business improvement areas that have worked so hard over the years and are succeeding. Suddenly you would have this enormous sucking sound where all the vitality comes out of all the rest of the areas and is directed to one place. And people are really speaking up. And my suspicion, I'm going to make a prediction here on air,
Okay.
I think this is going to be turned back. I think it does. As my case in St. Paul, which I call a time to say no, I think this is a time to say no. And I think this point about not going for the big bang in one place, but having the patience to cultivate the city in many places and to improve things in many places is a really important lesson. And one of the difficulties is that politicians often like to cut ribbons on big things.
Yeah, yeah.
Put their name to big things.
Put their name to big things. And city building, it's a patient process. Results take decades, so you go beyond any single political administration. And each succeeding council or mayor has to build on the successes of the previous ones, not try to tear it down and attack it. And the best cities are the ones where you have these multi-generational efforts. Chicago has been working on its waterfront for 100 years.
And it went,
over 100 years.
it's certainly much nicer than Toronto, so I happen to like Chicago, but it's still, there's room for improvement.
Yeah.
Oh, there's always room for improvement.
Where I was recently was Halifax,
Yeah.
and it's a very small scale, but they do have sort of a market area and you know, a courtyard, and the city always has entertainers, and people are just kind of milling around, and it's just a destination place.
But that's building those rich public spaces, the commons, the kind of things that you were mentioning in your book there, and I'm familiar with coming from England and traveling in Europe. You know, there's those gathering squares where you've got the cafes all around, and on Sunday you got the buskers and everybody comes, and it's just a place to meet and socialize. And we don't seem to have many of those. I know my relatives coming over, certainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, how do you guys survive here? There's no social scene, right? So we need to make sure that those are part of our fabric, that we have those big gathering spaces where people can...
And they have to be interesting and varied
Dynamic.
and real.
Right.
If they're just, if they
Fabricated.
feel artificial, if
Right.
they feel like a theme park
Or a movie set.
or a movie set, it just...
I know exactly what you mean, but what about if it did have a theme? And we encourage, because sometimes it happens accidentally, and I think you did mention that in your book, that you'll have a sort of little couple of blocks where it's a lot of antique shops.
Absolutely.
And you know, people say, well, we want exclusivity, we want to be the only antique shop in this strip. They don't realize that actually people enjoy when there's things that are grouped, and there's a few bicycle shops, or there's a few, and maybe that's what the waterfront needs, is some kind of theme, maybe sporting equipment, maybe antiques
Themes
shows.
in that sense are great, and you know, you'll get in Philadelphia, for example, there's a street where all the jewelers have concentrated. So if somebody's shopping for a wedding ring, you can wander that particular street. But that happened organically over time.
They saw the benefit and they did that in New York too, right?
I ended up staying in Mexico City through a recommendation from my barber, funnily enough, in this area, which was the wedding capital of Mexico City. And everybody who sold wedding gowns, who sold flowers, who sold everything that had to do with weddings. And you can imagine the population of Mexico City and 25 million people, how extensive this was. And it was fascinating. And I stayed in a little hotel which was for travelers from provincial cities in Mexico who were coming to buy wedding stuff. So that kind of thing is wonderful. What I'm talking about is when somebody wants to instantaneously create or duplicate something they've seen somewhere else, and they think they can come up with all the ingredients all at once, and it's all controlled by one corporation behind the scenes. We have to learn how to let diversity occur, and different people do different things to add up to a wonderful whole, and it's the orchestration.
It's the public-private collaboration.
Right.
And I think that that is what makes cities work well.
Yeah.
Because too often the sort of public officials are trying to ram their ideas, and private businesses aren't interested. And the fact is if we consult with private business people and developers and we say, well, what is your ideas and how can we collaborate and make a partnership, I think that that creates the best harmony in terms of a city.
One of the biggest lessons for me, and I talk about it in the book, is that it gradually dawned on me that cities are the most remarkable of human creations. Because here we have in some cases millions of people. My son lives in Tokyo.
Well, they say we're going to have 8 million people in Toronto. I think we have 4.5 million now, and they're predicting in another 20, 25 years that we'll be doubling the population of the GTA, not Toronto. Yeah. That's an incredible number of people. Are we going to have pushers like in Tokyo?
Well, what's fascinating about Tokyo is that you have the entire population of Canada in one city, and yet the manners that people have developed to be cognizant of each other.
If you don't, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So for example, I went with my son, daughter-in-law, and 2 granddaughters on bicycles around the city, and I thought, this is impossible, given the crowds of people. How are we ever going to get through? And you think of all the arguments we're having these days about sharing the roads in Toronto. Well, lo and behold, in Tokyo, with this masses of population, people are incredibly good at sharing the road or the sidewalks, and they make way for each other. So one of the things the skills that we're going to have to learn in our society, and we mostly see this in the roads now, road rage, pedestrians walking along with their handheld devices who don't make eye contact.
Well, I think
paying any attention to what's going on.
Cyclists who act like kamikazes.
I think it's a whole atmosphere, and the roads, it just shows up dangerously.
Yeah.
But you see it everywhere. You see it in restaurants, you see it in stores. People are quite rude. People don't even hold the door for somebody who's carrying parcels or for somebody who's disabled. They had that program where acts of kindness, random acts of kindness. I don't see why we have to have random acts of kindness. I don't see why people could just not be just kind all the time. Why does it have to be on a special day or for a special event? But people are living things. We sort of separate ourselves from the animal world, and we keep talking about ecosystems, and I want to ask you how you feel about David Suzuki and some of his ideas. I don't want to forget. But aren't we an ecosystem in a city? And everything has to function in order for that ecosystem to be healthy, and people ran away from cities because they became unhealthy.
We are part of nature. Nature is not something separate from us. And one of the great learning curves that we're enjoying now is the idea that we recognize natural systems, and hydrology has a lot to do with it, but not only. Vegetation, treatment of soils,
the trees,
everything contributes, and rather than thinking that we can dominate nature, which we always wanted to do through heavy engineering solutions, to actually work with things like bioremediation, for cleansing soil, work with natural process. It just makes places so much more interesting, attractive, agreeable, and I think kids nowadays are starting to get it. They're starting to understand those interrelationships.
Well, it's very hard if our public officials aren't on board. They announced in Ontario that we're going to have a ban on pesticides. And then when the raw law actually gets written into regulations, all of a sudden they come up with the exemptions. And what's exempt? 90%.
Golf courses.
Yeah.
Everything's exempt. No, everything's exempt except for my lawn. That's basically it.
Yeah, they make-
Because, you know, golf courses are exempt, and
Farming.
forestry and farming, and, well, what's most of the land? So, you know, I would say that what we need to do is figure out how to have safer pesticides instead of, you know, just having bans. If we can encourage people don't like using pesticides, but they felt they didn't have alternatives.
But I also think it's got to be a change in perspective as well, right? I mean, we've come to believe that the dandelion and the yellow in the green lawn is awful, and a bit of clover is awful. If you actually figured it out, it makes your lawn healthier to have some of these things in, because they fix the nitrogen, they help. So what we found is that these systems you're talking about are much more complicated than we ever thought, and they're much more intertwined. And we've always believed technology, we can figure out all problems with technology, and we probably can eventually, although we don't have it all figured out now, but the cost is exorbitant. And you're wondering, why do we have to pay for something that if we paid attention to let the natural systems work, it does it for us? We're just very wasteful. We're very... It seems crazy to have to pay for something that can come naturally. So I think we're beginning to realize the power of nature to take care of some of our problems if we work with it, rather than just figure we're going to do something different and override it. And
Yeah, it takes a lot of thought, and people usually look for the easy and the cheapest way out, unfortunately. We have a development coming in the Markham area, Langstaff and Highway 7. Have you looked over the plans for that at all, Ken? I know you have to go to a press conference soon, so I want to get your opinion on a few things.
I don't know them in any detail. I know some of the other things that are going on in Markham, along Highway 7 and the city center, which they're developing at a GO station. And Markham, generally, I'm not particularly familiar with the Langstaff proposals, but I think Markham generally is making some really interesting steps in terms of becoming a more progressive community. And I do say in the book that Markham is one place where I've worked. Mississauga is another. I've been working there with Hazel McCallion and her team. Mississauga City Center is transforming itself from a giant regional mall into a real set of urban neighborhoods, and aggressively transforming some of the big roads, turning them into multimodal, that is transit, walking, cycling, places, bringing in mixed use, getting some of the shopping out of Square One onto streets, and not just the typical stuff you would find in the mall, but daily life shopping, food shopping, all of those kinds of things are happening. Sheridan College is coming in. Oakville is another place that has made great strides. So we're seeing a number of places in the GTA that are really doing some very interesting things in terms of transforming themselves.
well, I'm hoping you're going to add Vaughan to your list in another 5 years.
Well,
we'll
Yeah,
be able
well,
to show
Deb
you.
and I are inviting you to apply,
back.
because you know what Ken, you know, one of the things Ken has taught us is that if you don't try, you're not going to succeed. So if you don't call Random House with your proposal for a book, you're not going to be publishing a book. And if you don't, you know, go out and meet Jane Jacobs and apply for jobs to work with the city, and you also have your own consulting firm now. The email address is greenbergconsulting.com.
That's right.
And so people should look for you. And I don't want you to be late for, I know, so we're going to kind of wrap it up. I want to really thank you for coming out. And I hope that you'll be networking a little bit with Deb.
I'm going to be calling him up.
Okay.
Because,
Yeah, I think
some presentations to
I
the
think
rest of council would be
Christmas is
great.
coming,
I
and
should
for
be
all the councillors,
My
I'm going to
gift is-
suggest with Deb that's her gift.
think that would
It's
be very good.
$29.95, I believe, from Random House, and you don't have to be an architect or a city planner to really enjoy it. So I want to thank Ken for joining us, and I don't want him to be late for his important press conference.
Okay, well, let me thank you, and I look forward to coming see some of the wonderful things that you'll be doing in Vaughan.
Well,
Thank you.
We'll keep
Okay.
pushing.
We will.
Thanks a lot. Take
Okay.
care. Hi and welcome back. Ken went to his important Waterfront Toronto news conference. So hopefully they can get moving on the waterfront in Toronto, because it's very disappointing when you go to cities like Chicago, right, Deb? Yep. And you see how beautiful their waterfronts can be. So Deb and I are now going to review a little bit about Vaughan. About Vaughan. Well, not just about Vaughan. What we've learned, how it can be applied. Mm-hmm. And I was driving, I guess it was 2 days ago only, up Mount Pleasant from Dundas. And I hadn't been on Mount Pleasant, I don't know, quite a while. And I was just amazed. I'm glad I didn't get too distracted while driving, but I did slow down at the type of buildings that they've built. Beautiful, with beautiful balconies, about 6 stories, so not high rises, but condos, apartments, I have no idea. But the main floor was pretty boutiques and coffee shops and small grocery stores, and it was block after block, and there were lots of pedestrians. And then after a few blocks of just this beautiful visual sort of atmosphere with people, all of a sudden we hit a strip mall. And I remember remarking to my son, I said, look how out of place that strip mall is in this nice area with the cars parked in front. And I think that in order for Vaughan to move forward with high density, we have to figure out a way not to have high rises for blocks where there's no walking of pedestrians. Ground floors have to be some kind of retail and businesses. But also, what can we do, Deb? What can we do about the strip malls?
Well, I was going to just basically talk to a little bit of what we mentioned in the previous session, where you were talking about we've got this Vaughan Metro Centre, and we need to make sure that we don't just have one spot and everywhere else. You were trying to say let's spread it around the city.
Right.
So to a certain extent, we have, but we've tried to focus it along some corridors. And the reason, of course, you do that is because we are trying to make it more pedestrian. The walking home idea, where you are not forcing people to have to get in their cars. And if you do it all over the city, everywhere, you force people to have to get in their car to go to that particular building or go and experience that opportunity. By putting it in a corridor, which is the vision along 7, along Jane, got the same thing along Centre Street, and we're working on right now with a secondary plan, and up Yonge. So we've got a couple of areas of the city where we're trying to get this idea which you're talking about, where we get a more density, but we do the mixed use, so people can live, work, and shop in the same area, and hopefully play too. So we've got to do this right. So it's, again, to go back to, it's not how dense you make it, it's how you make it dense, which is in the book, which I really think is so important. The challenge is how to do that. How do you, and it's that partnership with the developers, because the developers are a very important player.
Right,
in all of
obviously.
this, right? So we have to get the same vision. Their objective is to make money, and there's no problem with that, but we need to make sure that we have a common vision on how we're going to do that, and that has to be to the benefit of the city as well. And the residents in the city is what I really mean.
Well, maybe we have to offer incentives. Can the city afford, because we're so over budget with our new city hall, and I haven't read or heard any rumors, but I imagine that there's some heads banging on the wall on the rebate for the election. That was the first time that we gave a rebate. And I mean, that had to have cost the city. Do you have any figures for?
We haven't been given the report yet, but I think it wasn't as big as you'd imagine.
Really? Because people didn't file, and any candidates who didn't file, they're unfortunately, and I think we're going to hear a lot of complaining about that, because there wasn't anywhere on the rebate form that said, by the way, if the candidate that you're donating to does not file on time or ask for an extension, and then file on time with the extension, that you will not be receiving your rebate.
There's a learning process. I mean, I sat on the Democratic Renewal Task Force with many other bright sparks in the community that came up with ideas to try and make it more democratic, more open, and have more participation. That was the goal, and that was one of the suggestions we had. We wanted to try and decouple the politicians from the need to get the money from potentially the development industry, give them an opportunity to do it a different way. How do you incentivize the public to get engaged? There's a way. You give $200, you get $175 back. That's a pretty nice situation to allow candidates to get enough money to run a campaign and not have to rely on the standard normal ways to do that, which is corporations and
Okay, so good. I'm feeling better that they'll continue the program
Well,
because I think it's an important program.
Really, I'm hoping we do. Obviously, we need to do that based on data. I'm all an engineer and based on data. So let's look at the cost.
Yeah.
Let's see what the implications are. What I'm hearing is it is not as big as you would think because there wasn't that many really participating in it, and of course it is only the ones that file it correctly.
So I feel that, you know, if we're talking about developing areas where people can live and shop and work, shouldn't we have started with our own city hall? Our city hall is in the middle of Maple, but how many people feasibly, I mean, there's no real high density near the city hall. Maybe the old city hall should be turned into what I was, you know, suggesting, this beautiful building. I can take a picture of it because there's one building that really stands with curved balconies.
Please do that. Okay,
I will.
The ideas are helpful.
Find out who the developer was. That, you know, to build a 6-story, condos on the top, maybe fronting Major Mac in the front, store fronting. There's already plenty of parking there. And then maybe in the back it could be townhouses, you know, on a sort of a private laneway or with a little park and things like that.
You may, well, if you drive up there now, you're going to see that's already starting to happen. If you do a little bit around the Keel and Kipling, not Kipling, Keel and Major Mac area, just north, you're seeing that kind of storefronts with some apartments. You see that along Major Mac to the west of Keel. You saw some of that happening. And there are applications coming in now looking to try and do that live-work combination. We had an application that came forward, public hearing on Tuesday night. So it is going to happen. We have the GO station right there. It makes a lot of sense. Where we have the Lowe's and you know, the shopping area that's just on the east side of the tracks, but we have a GO station there. So you're absolutely right. It makes perfect sense. It's finding that balance. You know, you've got the traditional communities that do not want to have density by them, but if we can prove that those communities are going to get benefits out of it, that's the problem. They only see the negatives because it's more cars, more congestion. Where's the benefits to us? So if we can do better parks, better public spaces, we can build those into some of the development, then you start being able to show the community there's an enhancement. And if it isn't going to make a big impact to the traffic because they are using the GO, how do you make sure that happens? That's the difficult point, right?
What people really want is they want the subway. And what I'm finding, certainly in Thornhill, is that people are willing to have high density if it means they will get the subway. Because, you know, sort of what I've been explaining to people is it's not feasible to bring a subway up to the suburbs where there's not enough density.
But they're doing it, right? They're bringing it up to something that isn't there yet, but there's a potential. This Vaughan Metro Centre doesn't exist. It's all surrounded by employment, so there's a good point there, but we don't have it there. So they're bringing it up. It's an amazing opportunity for our city. We just need to make sure we don't waste it.
Well, there already is high density. Personally, I think we have it a little backwards. I think the subway, the priority should have been up Yonge Street. I think it needs to go to both. I also think it needs to go from York University to the airport, and not have a whole separate. I don't know why downtown to the airport, a separate transit system. Downtown already has an airport, which is taking advantage of it, and there are only long haul flights that they're going out to Pearson, and it completely doesn't serve travelers going to the airport from York Region and from.
There's no doubt that that's a gap that should have been closed a long time ago. Any world-renowned city doesn't have this. They have, you know, rapid transit to connect their city with the airport. We're lagging badly. So yes, that's an essential. I won't disagree that it seems a little odd to have the Spadina line come up before the Yonge line. There's a lot of issues on the Yonge line that I guess had to be work through. There's a big push from York Region and the city to make sure that is the next project in the hopper and comes through. So I won't disagree that it seems a little odd, but it's a wonderful opportunity for us. The city needed to connect York University with Toronto and make that work, and it wasn't much of a stretch to carry on up if you're going to start going and doing that. So we've been given a gift. We need to make sure that we take full advantage of that through building a very viable, compact urban area right there, and that's the plan. I don't know if you've sat down and actually had a look at the plan. I think there is a concern, as I've had when they brought that forward, that where's all the parking? Now, if you're going to build a walkable city, taking, as Ken has said in this book, you want to be very careful about taking a lot of space for cars. Cars take up a lot of room. So how
Well, I think that there has to be a parking lot, maybe adjacent to York Mills Mall, or where they're planning to build the new Vaughan Hospital, that has a shuttle service to the new city center.
And that has been talked about.
Has it? Oh, good. So it's kind of something that I've been throwing out there a bit. You know, the other thing that Ken discussed in his book is renewal. To not just tear down buildings to create higher density, but what can we do in existing neighborhoods? Well, the obvious one is basement apartments, which, you know, some people don't. I mean, there's tons of basement apartments already. You know, I find basement apartments a little bit disturbing because when they're illegal, people are living there, nobody's inspecting, they can't even vote a lot of times, and there are safety issues. Well, there's also safety issues in terms of having people live above businesses. And we've seen that in Toronto, where people are above, say, a restaurant. And the restaurant could be open, a restaurant catches fire, the restaurant's open till midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning for parties. Imagine trying to live upstairs. Are there going to be special bylaws, or are there special bylaws in place? What kind of businesses can be in a building where there are also residences?
You know, that's a good question, and I have to be honest. I don't think I've sat down and analyzed the actual zoning bylaws specific to the new direction that we're going. So you've given me a little marker to think about going back. I'm sure our planning group has had a look at that, but I haven't been able to confirm that. So I can't answer that particular question.
Because I would suggest that, you know, if the noise, you know, is till 11,
there's
that the businesses can't be open past 11 and can't open before 7 in the morning. So if you're going to locate any kind of restaurant there, well, you can't have a party that goes past 11.
And we do have bylaws. They would have to have a special exception, and then that would have to be considered based on the surrounding community, right? I mean, so there is already rules in place that cover the noise, the 11 o'clock. But in terms of special uses and that, to answer that question, I don't have that. But let's get back to secondary suites. I don't know if you know that, but the province has passed legislation now that we all have to address this.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yes, so it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so that's something that we're looking for a report back from our staff to tell us how we're going to do this. And because we have to do it. So it's happening, it's already in our communities, and I totally agree. It is not appropriate to have it illegally, because then you've got people living in a situation where it may not be safe. And I would much prefer to have this well thought through and then make them legal. People may resist that because they would say our taxes will be higher, and you know, that's not anything we want. I'm not sure if that's really true. Because you're...
Why would the taxes be higher?
Well, because then there'd be more value in the house, right? It would fetch a higher price.
Well, I know, but you're renting out space in your house, and those people should be paying the taxes.
No, property tax.
Oh, just property tax,
yeah,
okay.
So they're worried about property taxes going up. If it's made legal, then we have recognize that they now have you know, a second dwelling, a second residence.
Well, they should be paying more in taxes because it's a second dwelling with extra garbage collection. They should be able to allow to put out their own, you know, 3 bags of garbage every 2 weeks and things like that.
And that's
then,
why you
know,
want to make it legal, because
right.
That's definitely an issue we have right now where people are doing this illegally. We've got mountains of garbage out the front, and can't get it picked up, or they have to pay. And sometimes they don't want to, and they're doing some dumping. So, you know, these are complicated issues that we have to work through, but I do think the right way to go is to make them legal and make the system work properly for people.
Well, maybe we have to make them legal in certain areas to begin with, because it can get kind of tricky, and it has to be legal if there's, you know, if you're providing, say, if it's a 2-car garage, that you're not going to have 2 cars yourself. You're going to provide 1 parking spot, you know, or 1 place in the garage or things like that, because I think we've both kind of, you know, traveled to different neighborhoods, and we've seen areas where, you know, it's pretty obvious that there's multi-families and many people living here because just by the numbers of the cars. And that's frustrating too, because we have developed a community that is so car dependent that now it's very difficult to go out and fix it. And we knew what we were doing, and we continue to do it. So it's a little frustrating, but it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. And I think that that's a little bit what Ken spoke about. And I thought one of the interesting things he suggested is that they've rezoned in some areas where extra houses were built on properties where they had the laneways in the back. We don't have much of that in Vaughan. There is in York Region, Markham and things, Cornell area and places like that, where they built these laneways in the back. Some of the new areas...
We actually do, in the community I'm in, Sonoma Heights, we have those. But it's pretty tight. I don't think you can fit another.
No, I was trying to imagine, and I just thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous. People have garages back there, and you're going to turn them into apartments. Well, you could if there was great public transportation, and people weren't going to need that garage.
Exactly.
But it's a tough sell. It's a really tough sell, and I think that we need to develop more areas like the Sarah. I don't know if you.
I know that I like it. I think it's a good start in the right direction. I think it's not as good as we want to be, but I think it's very nicely done. And I actually had a little campaign post there for one day, and during the campaign, and I set up a little booth there. We did a cleanup.
I remember the cleanup. Yeah.
And I was delighted to see the people coming to, I think it was Starbucks on the corner there, and they were playing chess, and they were just walking from the local communities and sitting on that big patio area. There was just seats there. They didn't even need to actually get a Starbucks coffee, but it all worked well because they came, they met with other neighbors, they were hanging out on the patio there, enjoying the evening. It was the kind of feel you get when you're down.
And even if people have driven and parked behind, well, first of all, there's a lot of condos, and they're still building more condos, so those people obviously will walk. But even if they drove their car and parked, the cars were out of the way, and it just encouraged people to interact. And you'll see people, unfortunately, it's only one block. My understanding was it was going to be a larger area.
That's the point that I made. It's not enough, right, to really make it happening. But it's an idea. It's a step in the right direction. Now we need to start doing that elsewhere, making it more than just the one little strip, right? I'm also concerned. We're trying to urbanize some of our villages by bringing, certainly along Kipling and Woodbridge Avenue, bringing the building straight up to the edge of the sidewalk, and to try and make it more urban and have interaction. But it eliminates any opportunity to have that patio space. So I'm kind of a little bit at odds with some of the planning staff, because I'm saying, I understand the idea and the thought to bring the buildings closer. You're not having them way back, and there's no action on the street. But you've got to provide a space to have that action. And patios are a great way to do that, to get people mingling and socializing, and if you bring the building right up to the edge of the sidewalk, you can't do that. So I think we need to have a better balance.
How about, seeing as we have so many dogs, and I've just for the first time acquired one, that we develop an area that's dog friendly? But that's the selling point. Has that been suggested ever? Because I feel like we could stand to have sort of one little place where dogs are welcome to come in the patio and come in the stores. And obviously anybody who's operating any kind of restaurant, I don't see the problem with dogs on patios. I don't know if that's a provincial regulation or a municipal, because in Toronto there are areas where dogs can come into stores and come on the patios and things like that. That maybe it would be a draw. Something to try.
It's an interesting idea. There's dogs all over the city. Every community you go into, there's a lot of dogs, a lot of pets, cats too. But dogs are part of the family. Many people don't have kids; they have pets, dogs. Many older people, that's the companionship that they have. And I don't disagree that we need to make sure that our city is accommodating dogs. We have the one dog park. It took a very long time to get that through, but it's been quite successful. I think it's over too many dogs going to one place takes away from the enjoyment of it, and it kind of degrades it. So we need to have more of them throughout the city, and I'm actively working with some of the councillors to try and see if we can get some in some of the other wards.
What concerns me with off-leash parks is that first of all, there's so many dogs often, but are people picking up after their pet?
Well, the nice thing about having a dog park is that there's usually enough people that apply the pressure to those that come in to follow the rules. It's when you don't have a concentration of people in an area that people often don't pick up because nobody's around, they don't pick up. But in a dog park, there's enough people there, and if somebody's dog goes and they don't pick up, you know, somebody's going to say something, hey, you know what, that's not appropriate, can you go pick up after your dog? And people don't want to be seen not to following the rules.
Do you have a dog?
I have a black lab,
wow.
and I love my dog, and that's why I'm passionate about trying to get more opportunities for dogs off leash park. Dogs need to come off the leash and run around, chase a frisbee, chase a ball, just go and explore. It's like tying a kid. Their mentalities are at 2 years old, right? It's like tying a 2-year-old kid on a string and expecting them to be happy. They're just not. They need to run around and exercise themselves. So we need to be more accommodating of that portion of our.
Well, I've always felt that people, you know, people look at me a little strangely, but they go along with some of my suggestions sometimes, that people need to have play dates for their dogs just like they do with their kids. And most of us have pretty big backyards. And if they're, you know, I've had my dog running around just in my backyard, off leash, obviously. And it's much happier when it has another dog to run with.
Absolutely. They're like
just,
kids.
There's a limit to how much running I can do. You know, I don't know that people are realizing that their dogs have to socialize. From what I'm reading, I never thought about a lot of these things, obviously, until I had one.
Yeah.
But dogs really do need to know how to socialize with other dogs and socialize often. And what I'm seeing is people are getting 2 dogs, and to me, that's not really the answer.
Yeah.
You know, they feel they're lonely, they need a friend. Well, there's so many dogs on the street. Why aren't you getting together?
Well, I don't want to belabor it, but, you know, dogs are pack animals, and many people get a dog and then they go to work all day, and the dog's sitting at home all on their own. And that's why having the second dog, at least the dogs can do something together during the day.
They destroy the house together.
Often the dogs, well, no, usually if they're on their own, they'll find something to do, and it's chew the furniture or, you know, cause some trouble, right? Because they're frustrated, they're bored. So having another dog is one option, I guess. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you've got a dog, they need to socialize, and the earlier you do that, the better, right?
Okay, well, we're going to do an episode on dogs.
Okay, we're
going to, yeah, okay, great, good. I'm going to say goodbye for today. It's been really fun having Deb come out, and especially she's so knowledgeable on many of the issues with the city, what's going on, and she's going to keep me informed. I really appreciate it, Deb. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see all of you soon.
Thank you.